At 8:43 p.m. on a cold February night, police entered a quiet suburban home in Atlanta and found what looked like a family dinner interrupted by violence. But when detectives stepped into that dining room, what they saw would haunt them for years. A father lay dead at the head of the table. His daughter-in-law sat trembling in the corner, blood on her hands. And his son, the husband, was nowhere to be found. 3 people walked into that house that night. Only 2 walked out alive. This is the story of Tiffany, Marcus, and Robert Coleman, a story of forbidden desire, shattered trust, and a single moment that destroyed everything. What you're about to hear isn't just about betrayal. It's about how the people we trust most can become the ones who hurt us deepest, and how one woman's choice would cost 3 people everything they had. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Tiffany Coleman was 33 years old when this story begins, a real estate agent in the Atlanta suburbs with a smile that could sell any house and ambition that burned quietly beneath her perfect exterior. She'd been married to Marcus Coleman for 8 years, a marriage that had started with passion and promise, but had slowly settled into something comfortable, something safe, something that felt more like friendship than romance. Marcus was a good man, the kind who remembered anniversaries and fixed things around the house without being asked, but somewhere along the way, the spark had faded into routine. They weren't unhappy exactly, just distant, like 2 people living parallel lives under the same roof. Marcus worked long hours as an operations manager at a logistics company, often traveling for days at a time, leaving Tiffany alone in their 3-bedroom house with nothing but silence and her thoughts. She told herself this was normal, that all marriages went through phases, that the butterflies and late-night conversations were just part of being young and naive. But deep down, she felt invisible, like she was fading into the background of her own life. Then there was Robert Coleman, Marcus's father, 56 years old and everything Marcus wasn't. Robert was a retired contractor who'd built a successful business from nothing, a man with rough hands and smooth words, charismatic in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. He'd lost his wife, Marcus's mother, to cancer 5 years earlier, and since then he'd thrown himself into being present for his son's family, showing up at birthdays and holidays, offering to help with home repairs, taking Tiffany and Marcus out to dinner at the Italian restaurant he frequented downtown. To anyone looking in, they were the picture of a close family, 3 people bound by blood and love, supporting each other through life's challenges. Sunday dinners at Robert's house were tradition, filled with laughter and stories, and the smell of his famous barbecue ribs. Neighbors would see them in the driveway, Robert's arm around Marcus's shoulder, Tiffany laughing at something Robert said, and think how lucky they were to have each other. But beneath that perfect surface, something was shifting, something subtle and dangerous that none of them saw coming. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what Tiffany told herself. Robert began showing up at her open houses, claiming he was just in the neighborhood or wanted to see how business was going. He'd walk through the empty rooms with his hands in his pockets, complimenting her staging choices, telling her she had a gift for making spaces feel like home. At first, Tiffany appreciated the support. Marcus rarely asked about her work, too buried in his own deadlines and travel schedules, but Robert seemed genuinely interested. He'd stay after the other visitors left, helping her pack up sign-in sheets and lock up, their conversations stretching longer each time. He asked about her dreams, what she wanted beyond selling houses, whether she felt fulfilled, questions Marcus hadn't asked in years. Tiffany found herself looking forward to these visits, enjoying the attention, the way Robert looked at her when she spoke, like every word mattered. He started texting her during the day, nothing inappropriate at first, just checking in, asking how showings went, sending funny articles about the real estate market. When Marcus was out of town, Robert would offer to come over and fix things, a leaky faucet, a squeaky door hinge, things Marcus had been promising to handle for months. Tiffany knew it was getting complicated, knew there was something in the way Robert looked at her that crossed the invisible line between family and something else, but she pushed those thoughts away. He was her father-in-law, Marcus's dad, a man grieving his wife who just needed connection. She told herself she was being paranoid, reading too much into kindness, but her body betrayed her thoughts. Her pulse quickened when his truck pulled into the driveway. She found herself changing clothes before he arrived, putting on makeup for someone who was supposed to be family. Marcus noticed nothing, or if he did, he said nothing, too focused on his next promotion, his next business trip, his next thing that wasn't her. One evening in late summer, Robert came over to install new shelves in the garage. Marcus was in Houston for a conference. Tiffany made iced tea and brought it out to the garage, watching Robert work in the humid heat, his shirt clinging to his back. They talked about nothing and everything, about Marcus's childhood, about Robert's marriage, about loneliness, and how it creeps up on you when you're not looking. When he climbed down from the ladder, he stood close, too close, and for a moment neither of them moved. Tiffany could smell his cologne mixed with sweat, could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see something in his eyes that terrified and thrilled her at the same time. Nothing happened that night. Robert left, and Tiffany stood in the garage trying to steady her breathing, telling herself she'd imagined it, but the air between them had changed, charged with possibility and danger. Over the next few weeks, the texts became more frequent, more personal. Robert started calling her beautiful, telling her Marcus didn't know how lucky he was, saying things that made her stomach flip. Tiffany knew she should shut it down, should tell Marcus, should create distance, but instead she found herself texting back, sharing things she'd never told anyone, admitting how lonely she felt, how invisible she'd become in her own marriage. Robert listened in a way Marcus hadn't in years, made her feel seen and wanted and alive again. She started deleting their text threads, a small act of deception that felt massive, the first brick in a wall of lies she was building without fully realizing it. Late one night, after too much wine and another argument with Marcus about his travel schedule, Tiffany texted Robert something she could never take back. Just 3 words that changed everything. "I miss you." His response came seconds later. "I miss you too, more than I should." And just like that, the line was crossed. Marcus Coleman hadn't been on a business trip. He'd been one town over, sitting in a hotel room watching footage from cameras he'd secretly installed in their home 2 weeks earlier. He'd suspected something for months, little things that didn't add up. Tiffany's sudden interest in her appearance, her phone always face down on the counter, her distraction during conversations, the way she tensed when he touched her. At first, he'd dismissed it as paranoia, told himself he was imagining things because work stress was making him crazy, but then he'd seen a text notification flash on her phone screen when she was in the shower. Just a preview, a few words from a contact labeled with just a letter. The message read, "Can't stop thinking about you." Marcus's stomach had dropped. He'd wanted to confront her right then, to demand answers, but something stopped him, some instinct that told him he needed to know the full truth before he acted. So he'd done something he never thought he'd do. He installed 2 small cameras, one in the living room, one in their bedroom, hidden devices no bigger than USB drives that connected to his phone, and he told Tiffany he had a 3-day trip to Chicago for a quarterly review. What he saw over those 3 days shattered him completely. On the first night, Tiffany was alone, talking on the phone to someone, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with Marcus in years, her voice soft and intimate. On the second day, his father's truck pulled into the driveway at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus had watched from his hotel room as Robert walked into his house, as Tiffany greeted him at the door wearing a dress Marcus had never seen, as they stood close in the kitchen talking, Robert's hand on the small of her back. They'd moved to the couch, and Marcus forced himself to keep watching even as nausea rose in his throat. He watched them kiss, watched his father's hands on his wife, watched Tiffany respond with an eagerness she'd never shown him, and something inside Marcus died. But the worst part, the part that made him actually physically sick, was when they moved to the bedroom. His bedroom, the bed he shared with his wife, and his father, the man who'd taught him how to throw a baseball and fix a car and be a man, the man whose approval Marcus had spent his whole life seeking. That man was with his wife in their bed. Marcus had turned off the feed then, unable to watch anymore, and sat in that hotel room in the dark, trying to understand how his life had become this nightmare. He thought about confronting them both immediately, about driving home and walking in on them, about violence and revenge and all the dark impulses that flooded his mind. But he didn't move. He just sat there in shock, replaying every family dinner, every helpful visit, every time his father had insisted on being around Tiffany, and realized how blind he'd been. The betrayal from Tiffany was agonizing, but the betrayal from his father was something else entirely, something that cut so deep he couldn't find the bottom of the wound. This was the man who'd held him when his mother died, who'd told him blood was everything, who'd welcomed Tiffany into their family like a daughter. And he'd been sleeping with her, seducing her, destroying Marcus's marriage from the inside out while pretending to care. Marcus stayed in that hotel for 3 days, barely eating, not sleeping, trying to figure out what to do with this information. He thought about divorce, about simply walking away and leaving them both to their guilt, but that felt too easy, too clean. He thought about exposing them publicly, about sending the videos to everyone they knew. But that would destroy Tiffany, and he still, despite everything, didn't want to hurt her that badly. By the 3rd day, Marcus had made a decision. He'd go home and act normal, pretend he knew nothing, and wait for the right moment to confront them both together. He wanted to see their faces when the truth came out, wanted his father to have to look him in the eye and explain how he could do this, wanted Tiffany to understand the magnitude of what she'd destroyed. So he'd come home early that night, watching Tiffany jump when he walked in, seeing the guilt flash across her face even as she tried to smile. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus played his role perfectly, the oblivious husband, going to work, coming home, having dinner, acting like everything was normal, while rage and pain built inside him like pressure in a sealed container. He saw his father at a family dinner, shook his hand, listened to him talk about a contracting job, watched him look at Tiffany across the table, and said nothing. But Marcus was planning something, gathering evidence, documenting everything, preparing for the moment when he'd bring it all crashing down. That moment came on February 12th, when Robert called and invited them both to dinner at his house, saying he wanted to talk about something important. Marcus had smiled when he accepted the invitation. Perfect, he'd thought. Let's all have dinner and talk. Let's finally tell the truth. The evening of February 12th was unseasonably cold, one of those late winter nights where the temperature drops suddenly and rain threatens, but never quite falls. Tiffany had felt uneasy all day, a knot of anxiety in her stomach she couldn't explain. She'd texted Robert asking what the dinner was about, but he'd only replied that they'd talk when everyone was together. Marcus had been strangely quiet that morning, sitting at the breakfast table staring at his coffee without drinking it, and when Tiffany asked if he was okay, he'd just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said they should probably get going soon. She'd dressed carefully, choosing a cream sweater and jeans, putting on the pearl earrings Marcus had given her for their 5th anniversary, some part of her trying to appear normal, stable, like the good wife she'd stopped being months ago. The drive to Robert's house was tense, Marcus's hands tight on the steering wheel, country music playing low on the radio, neither of them speaking. Tiffany kept stealing glances at her husband, at the hard set of his jaw, the way he wouldn't look at her, and fear started creeping up her spine. Does he know, she thought, and immediately pushed the thought away. He couldn't know. They'd been so careful. Robert's house was a modest ranch-style home in an older neighborhood, the house where Marcus had grown up, filled with photos of happier times and the lingering smell of Robert's cigars. When they arrived, Robert greeted them at the door with forced cheerfulness, hugging Tiffany a moment too long, and she felt Marcus stiffen beside her. The dining room table was set for 3, Robert's attempt at domesticity with mismatched plates and paper napkins, a roast chicken in the center steaming in the overhead light. They sat down in their usual spots, Robert at the head of the table, Marcus and Tiffany on either side, and for several minutes they went through the motions of passing food and making small talk about weather and work. But the tension was suffocating, each of them waiting for something they couldn't name, the air thick with unspoken words. Tiffany pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone, watching Robert try to act normal and Marcus say almost nothing, and the knot in her stomach tightened until she thought she might be sick. Finally, Robert cleared his throat and said they needed to discuss something important, that he'd been thinking a lot about family and honesty, and doing the right thing. Tiffany's heart stopped. She looked at Robert with wide eyes, silently begging him not to do this, not now, not like this, but Robert wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Marcus, and there was something almost defiant in his expression, something that said he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending. "Marcus," Robert started, his voice heavy, "there's something I need to tell you about Tiffany and me." But before Robert could say another word, Marcus laughed, a cold, humorless sound that made both of them freeze. "Oh, Dad," Marcus said quietly, "you don't need to tell me anything. I already know." The room went silent. Tiffany felt the blood drain from her face. Robert's expression shifted from defiance to confusion to something close to fear. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, setting it on the table between them. "I've known for 3 weeks," Marcus continued, his voice eerily calm. "I have videos, photos, text messages, every dirty little moment of your affair in my house, in my bed, while I was supposed to be out of town." Tiffany started crying, soft sobs she couldn't control, but Marcus didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on his father. "How could you?" Marcus whispered, and now his voice cracked, rage and anguish breaking through the calm facade. "You're my father. She's my wife. How could you do this to me?" Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and suddenly he wasn't apologetic or ashamed. He was angry, defensive, years of resentment pouring out in a flood. "You want to know how?" Robert shouted back. "Because you don't appreciate her. You never did. You treat her like furniture, like she's just supposed to sit there and wait for you to notice her. Someone had to make her feel alive again." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tiffany was sobbing openly now, trying to speak, trying to apologize, but neither man was listening to her anymore. Marcus stood too, facing his father across the table, everything that had been building inside him for weeks erupting. "You ruined my life," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "You destroyed our family. Mom would be ashamed of what you've become. Don't you bring your mother into this," Robert snarled, and he moved around the table toward Marcus, and suddenly they were chest to chest, 40 years of father-son dynamics colliding with infidelity and betrayal. Tiffany screamed for them to stop, but they weren't hearing her, weren't hearing anything but their own rage. Marcus shoved his father backward. Robert stumbled, caught himself on the counter, and when he straightened up, there was something in his hand. A knife from the butcher block, 8 inches of stainless steel catching the light. Tiffany didn't know who moved first, didn't know exactly how it happened because everything was chaos and shouting and movement, but suddenly she was between them, grabbing for the knife, screaming that this had to stop, that she was sorry, that she'd fix this. And then there was a sound, sharp and impossibly loud, a sound that cut through everything else and left ringing silence in its wake. A gunshot. Tiffany looked down and saw blood spreading across Robert's white shirt, saw him stagger backward, his hand going to his chest, his face a mask of shock. The knife clattered to the floor. Robert's legs gave out and he collapsed, his head hitting the edge of the table on the way down, and then he was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes open but unfocused. Tiffany stood frozen, her hands shaking, powder residue on her fingers, the gun she hadn't even known Robert kept in the kitchen drawer smoking in her grip. The 911 call came in at 8:43 p.m., a woman's voice hysterical and barely coherent, screaming that someone had been shot, that they needed an ambulance, that there was so much blood. Police and paramedics arrived within 6 minutes to find Tiffany Coleman sitting on the front porch in shock, blood on her clothes and hands, rocking back and forth and mumbling that she didn't mean to, that it was an accident, that she just wanted them to stop fighting. Inside, officers found Robert Coleman dead at the scene, a single gunshot wound to the chest, blood everywhere, signs of a violent confrontation. And Marcus was gone. His truck was in the driveway, his phone on the dining room table next to his father's body, but Marcus himself had vanished. The lead detective, a woman named Sarah Martinez who'd been working homicide for 12 years, immediately knew this wasn't a simple domestic violence case. There were too many pieces that didn't fit, too many questions without answers. Why was there a gun involved at a family dinner? Where was the husband? And why did Tiffany's story keep changing every time they asked her what happened? In her initial statement at the scene, Tiffany said Robert and Marcus had been fighting, that Robert pulled a knife, that she'd grabbed the gun from the drawer to scare them into stopping, that it went off accidentally when Marcus tried to take it from her. But at the station 3 hours later, her story shifted. Now she said Robert had pulled the gun first, that she'd wrestled it away from him, that Marcus had run out of the house before the shot was fired. By the next morning, in a formal interview with her lawyer present, Tiffany claimed she didn't remember the moments before the shooting at all, that everything was a blur of shouting and movement, and then Robert was on the ground. Detective Martinez knew trauma could fragment memory, could make witnesses unreliable even when they were trying to tell the truth. But these weren't small inconsistencies. These were fundamental contradictions about who did what and when. And the physical evidence was raising more questions than answers. Gunshot residue was found on Tiffany's hands, consistent with her firing the weapon, but there were also defensive wounds on her arms, bruises that suggested she'd been grabbed or pushed. The knife found at the scene had Robert's fingerprints on it, but also trace amounts of blood that didn't match anyone at the scene. Marcus Coleman remained missing for 48 hours, during which time the media descended on the story like locusts, turning it into a national sensation. The headlines were sensational and cruel. Father and son fought over wife in deadly love triangle. Affair ends in murder at family dinner. Tiffany Coleman became the most hated woman in America overnight, her face plastered across news channels and social media, people calling her every vile name imaginable, threatening her life, dissecting every choice she'd made. The affair came out immediately, neighbors and friends giving interviews about how they'd suspected something, how Robert and Tiffany had seemed too close, how Marcus had seemed withdrawn in recent months. Armchair detectives on the internet built elaborate theories, some claiming Tiffany had planned the whole thing, that she'd manipulated both men to eliminate one and frame the other, others insisting Marcus had killed his father and fled, using Tiffany as a scapegoat. The truth, as always, was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. On the third day, Marcus walked into a police station in Birmingham, Alabama, 150 miles from Atlanta, and turned himself in. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt, and when Detective Martinez sat down across from him in the interview room, he just started talking. Marcus told them everything, the cameras, the videos, the weeks of watching and planning, the dinner he knew would explode into confrontation. He admitted he'd wanted to hurt his father, wanted to make him suffer the way Marcus had suffered, wanted both of them to face the consequences of their betrayal. But he swore he didn't kill him, didn't touch the gun, didn't even know there was a gun until the shot rang out. According to Marcus, he'd been shoving his father, years of rage boiling over, when Tiffany had screamed and suddenly there was blood everywhere and Robert was falling and Marcus had panicked. He'd run, he admitted, gotten in his truck and driven until he couldn't drive anymore, because he knew how it looked, knew he'd be blamed, knew his life was over either way. "But I didn't pull that trigger," Marcus said, looking Detective Martinez in the eye, "and I need you to believe that even if no one else does." The detective studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the evidence, trying to determine if this was truth or a carefully crafted lie. The forensics told a complicated story. The gun had been registered to Robert, kept in a kitchen drawer for home protection. The angle of the shot suggested someone shorter than Marcus had fired it, and the powder burns on Tiffany's hands were consistent with close-range firing. But there were no fingerprints on the gun itself, wiped clean either deliberately or by accident during the chaos. Over the next 2 months, investigators pieced together what they believed was the truth, a theory that fit most of the evidence, even if it couldn't answer every question. Robert and Marcus had fought, violently, both of them escalating a confrontation that should never have happened. Robert had grabbed a knife, not to use it but to threaten, to defend himself, maybe both. Marcus had pushed him, and in the chaos, Tiffany had made a split-second decision born from fear and desperation. She'd grabbed the gun from the drawer where she'd seen Robert put it months earlier, had fired once to stop the fighting, and the bullet had found Robert's heart. Whether she'd aimed or whether it was blind panic and terrible luck, no one could say for certain. Marcus's flight made him look guilty, but his story was consistent, and his genuine grief over his father's death was evident even through his rage at what his father had done. In the end, the district attorney made a decision that satisfied no one, but reflected the messy reality of what had happened. Tiffany Coleman was charged with voluntary manslaughter, not murder, the prosecution arguing she'd used excessive force in a situation she'd helped create but hadn't intended to kill anyone. Marcus was not charged, insufficient evidence to prove he'd been anything more than a witness to a tragedy born from his own discovery of betrayal. Tiffany Coleman pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter in May of that year, accepting a deal that gave her 12 years with possibility of parole after 8. In her statement to the court, she spoke for the first time publicly about what had happened, her voice barely above a whisper as she addressed Marcus, who sat in the back of the courtroom refusing to look at her. She said she'd made choices she could never take back, had hurt people she'd promised to love, had destroyed a family that had welcomed her. She said she'd replay that night for the rest of her life, wondering if she could have done something differently, said something that would have stopped the fighting, prevented Robert from reaching for that knife, kept her own hand from closing around that gun. She said she was sorry, though she knew the word meant nothing measured against what had been lost. Marcus gave no statement, just stood and left the courtroom before sentencing was complete. He moved to Oregon 6 months later, changed his name legally, cut ties with everyone who'd known him in his old life. In rare interviews years later, he spoke about betrayal and forgiveness, about how the people closest to you can inflict the deepest wounds, about learning to live with grief that has no clean resolution. Robert Coleman was buried in a small ceremony, attended by old friends and former colleagues. People who'd known him as a good man, a hard worker, someone who'd loved his son and mourned his wife, and who couldn't reconcile that man with the one who'd destroyed his family for an affair. The restaurant where he'd taken Tiffany and Marcus for Sunday dinners closed a year later, though whether that was related to the scandal or just bad business, no one could say. The house where the shooting happened was sold at a loss, the new owners unaware of its history, though neighbors whispered about it for years afterward, pointing it out to visitors as the place where that awful thing happened. Tiffany served her time quietly, taking college courses in prison, writing letters to Marcus that he never answered, seeing her own face occasionally on television when the case was discussed on true crime shows that turned tragedy into entertainment. She was released after 9 years for good behavior, walked out into a world that had moved on without her, and disappeared into obscurity, last seen working at a nonprofit in New Mexico. Her name changed, her past buried under layers of attempted redemption. The story of Tiffany, Marcus, and Robert Coleman became a cautionary tale about desire and boundaries, about how small compromises can lead to catastrophic consequences, about how quickly lives can unravel when people choose passion over loyalty. But it's also a story about the complexity of blame, because there's no single villain here, just 3 people who made progressively worse decisions until the only possible ending was destruction. Robert Coleman betrayed his son in the worst way imaginable, but he paid for it with his life. Marcus Coleman's surveillance and confrontation set in motion the events that killed his father, but he lost everything too, his marriage, his family, his sense of self. and Tiffany Coleman made choices that destroyed two men and her own future. But she pulled that trigger in a moment of panic, trying to stop violence she'd helped create. The question everyone asks is whether it was murder or tragedy, whether Tiffany deserved 12 years or should have gotten more, whether Marcus was complicit or just collateral damage. But maybe the real question is, how do we judge people at their absolute worst moment, when fear and rage and betrayal collide and someone ends up dead? How do you measure intention against consequence, understand actions taken in seconds that reverberate for decades? 3 people walked into that house for dinner on a cold February night. Only 2 walked out. One man died by a bullet fired from a gun he'd bought for protection. One woman went to prison for a killing she said was an accident. One man lost his father and his wife in the same moment and had to live with both losses for the rest of his life. There are no winners in this story, no justice that feels complete, no ending that brings peace to anyone involved. Just the cold reality that sometimes love isn't enough, that passion can poison what it's supposed to nurture, and that the moment you pull a trigger, accidentally or on purpose, you can never take that bullet back. Some say Tiffany was a victim of circumstance, a woman trapped between 2 men's egos who made a terrible choice in a moment of fear. Others say she was the architect of her own destruction, that every decision she made from the first kiss with Robert led directly to his death. The truth, like most truths, probably lives somewhere in between. What do you think really happened that night? Do you believe Tiffany acted in self-defense, that the shooting was truly an accident born from chaos and fear? Or do you think there was intention in that moment, revenge or rage or something darker that she'll never admit? And what about Marcus? Should he carry guilt for setting up a confrontation he knew would explode? Or was he just a man pushed past his breaking point by unimaginable betrayal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These stories affect us because they remind us how thin the line is between normal life and tragedy, how quickly everything can fall apart when trust is broken and emotions run too hot. If this story moved you, if it made you think about loyalty and consequences, and the choices we make when we think no one's watching, hit that like button. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the true stories we share every week. Stories about real people facing impossible situations, about the moments that define and destroy us, about the complicated truth that life rarely fits into neat categories of good and evil. Thank you for watching, and remember, the people you trust most have the power to hurt you deepest. So choose carefully who you let into your heart. Until next time.